Okay. Well, welcome to our webinar on the FCC and artificial intelligence. I'm Laura Stefani. I'm a partner in the telecommunications group. And today I'm joined by two great guests. One is Heather West, who is one of my colleagues here. She's one of our leads on AI at Venable, working on, among other projects, AI issues for the Alliance in Trust in AI. And Heather is a techie, having started out as a coder before moving on to managing issues like privacy and cybersecurity in AI policy for several technology companies. My other guest is Professor Monisha Ghosh, who's also a techie because she's a professor of electrical engineering, currently at the University of Notre Dame. And beyond her academic and research career, she's held a number of policy-making roles within the federal government, including most recently with the Federal Communications Commission. And she also has been a member of the FCC's TAC, their Technology Advisory Council. So thank you both for joining me today. Our agenda for our audience is that I'll start off with an overview on what we're seeing in DC and at the FCC right now with regard to artificial intelligence. And then Heather's going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the terminology surrounding AI, because I think it's really important that to understand this issue, we kind of are all on the same page as to what some of these terms mean. And also, given the work that she's currently doing, she'll touch on some recent federal developments on AI policy and kind of the whole of government. And after that, we'll turn to our focus on the FCC in particular, both on recent activities as well as areas where artificial intelligence may relate to its policymaking or rules. So clearly AI is big right now. Just this summer, we've seen, Senator Schumer lead educational forums on the Hill to get lawmakers up to speed. Big Tech has offered up a voluntary agreement at the White House. OSTP at the White House has taken comments on the issues. And in terms of our focus today, the FCC, they've been engaged in a number of different activities. But AI is nothing new in the telecommunications world. Simple AI has been used for decades for network management practices like routing calls, monitoring towers, monitoring outages. And on the device side, software-defined radios have been allowed for several decades. These are devices that can decide what frequency or modulation scheme or power levels are used, but in a very defined, knowable way, with the software fixed and submitted with a device application, so the FCC can know that the changes to the device can't cause interference or otherwise take the device out of compliance. And of course, on the customer service side, many of you telecommunications service providers, others regulated by the FCC, have been using chatbots and similar technologies to interact with your customers on the customer service side. But as I said, all of these are simple systems where the AI is limited, it's controlled, it's predictable, it's understandable. The hot debate now concerns the use of generative AI or other types of AI that can learn from the data, and allowing this in the context of what the FCC regulates, whether that's networks, devices, consumer issues like robocalls and text messages. That's going to be a step change in how the FCC has traditionally regulated, because now we're talking about regulating the unknown, the less predictable. And the FCC may no longer have precise or even pretty good knowledge or control over things such as what data set is used or how the software could morph over time and how that would affect things. So the FCC, like most of other government, is very much in learning mode right now. And the chairwoman and most of the commissioners have been talking about AI. They're very supportive of it, but the agency is kind of just starting to gather information. And a few of the things that we're seeing now that we'll discuss a little later today is the Technology Advisory Council, the TAC, has had an AI working group, and they made a presentation of a set of recommendations to the commission last December, which were, I thought, pretty soft and a little more focused on the agency understanding AI for its own use rather than regulation. The FCC also hosted an AI workshop in mid-July, which looked at the topic fairly generally. And then the FCC just put out a notice of inquiry adopted at its August meeting on the topic of advancing understanding of non-federal spectrum usage. That's essentially looking at data on spectrum use, what data is currently available, what should or could be collected, how the data may need to be protected, how the data should be used. And as part of this, the FCC did ask how the burgeoning growth of machine learning and artificial intelligence might facilitate insights into large and complex data sets. And I think that this is going to be a familiar refrain going forward the next few years as the FCC kind of asks about these AI type issues and proceedings that it puts out where that's relevant. So let's turn to Heather now, and we're going to advance the slides, and Heather is going to talk to us about basic AI terms.
Thanks, Laura. As Laura said, I think it's really important to make sure that we're all kind of working from the same baseline definitions here, with an understanding that all of this is evolving very quickly. But some of these are very helpful for having this conversation. There are a bunch of definitions floating around for artificial intelligence, and I will be the first to say I don't love very many of them. I think that they're very broad in comparison to what we actually mean right now when we're colloquially saying AI. There's a definition up there that's an OECD definition around AI, but when we were chatting about this, prepping for this call and deciding what we wanted to talk about, Manisha actually gave her kind of personal definition of AI, and I really like it. AI systems are those that are adaptive using data, or change their behavior based on data. And that makes sense to me. It's still fairly broad, and I think that we will spend a little bit of time talking about exactly what we mean when we're thinking about AI, and I think Manisha will be able to talk a little bit about what the FCC is thinking when they say AI. But it's a useful starting point. One of the things that's really useful to dig into is what makes AI, not just what it is, whether it's those chatbots, whether it's fraud and analytic or fraud detection and analytics. There's a bunch of pieces of this, but at their base, it's all algorithms. And the easiest way to describe that is really it's a bunch of recipes. It's a bunch of instructions for a computer to go and do, and then you come up with an output based on some input. And a human can execute on an algorithm too. A recipe is in fact an algorithm. You take some inputs, some ingredients, you follow some steps, you know, chopping up some vegetables, putting things in the oven, and you have an output. Hopefully it's a very delicious dinner. AI is much more complex. I think, you know, obviously less delicious. But one of the core pieces of that is an algorithm. Machine learning is a process where a computer system uses data and is trained to learn and adapt without to input data without the explicit involvement of a human. That learning may in fact be supervised by a person who can go in and annotate the training data and help that system learn. But machine learning is also a core element of artificial intelligence, especially as we are thinking about it right now in the context of the last year's worth of developments. And then the output of that machine learning is a model that is trained to recognize particular kinds of patterns and make predictions. And all of the AI that you've been hearing about, that the FCC is thinking about, you know, they're all models thinking through, you know, like computers thinking through the data and helping us understand the world and make predictions. Laura, can you go ahead and go forward one? Yes. Thanks. And Laura kind of touched on this a little bit, but there's lots of kinds of AI. And there's very narrow artificial intelligence that really just kind of marches forward and does what it's told. It's pretty easy to understand. That's something like my alarm clock. If I set it to go off at 6 a.m., it says, is it 6 a.m.? No, not yet. I won't do anything. Cool. And as time marches forward, eventually it hits 6 a.m., the alarm clock goes off, Awesome. Another phrase, highly capable artificial intelligence, is more of what the discussion that has captured Washington, D.C., Congress, the White House, all of our attention is more around highly capable artificial intelligence. For example, when I ask an open-ended question, it comes up with an interesting chatbot answer that makes me think a little bit. That's a pretty capable AI model. Often generative in that it creates an answer for me, an output for me that is new. It's not coming from a database. One phrase that I want to put out there, but then set aside, is artificial general intelligence or superintelligence. That is more like a human brain. That is artificial intelligence that functions with the kind of broad scope and capabilities that our brains do. I will say that we don't really know how to train that yet. That is not something that exists. So we don't necessarily need to think about it, especially within the context of the FCC's actions here. There are also some qualities of AI, and those are descriptors that I think we will dive into a little bit more. But explainability, the idea that a model, you can help people understand how a machine learning model works. And you can say, aha, I gave it this input. Because the model works this way, it gave me this output. And you can create explainability at a number of levels. Laura, did I
think that that's kind of something that the FCC has certainly embraced so far, in terms of the software-defined radio. If you can explain to us what's going to happen and we can kind of understand it, then, we're okay with it, because we're going to know that your device or whatever you're doing is going to stay within the FCC rules.
Yeah, and I think that that's an important quality, especially as we think about regulation and we think about oversight for these systems, right? It's very hard to regulate something that's completely unpredictable, but it's also important to remember that unpredictable AI is not particularly useful. If it is very unpredictable, who knows? If you had your calculator and it gave you unpredictable answers, you wouldn't use it. So I think that there's a piece of this that explainability is core, as you just said. Some other qualities: safety, accuracy, robustness. There's a whole laundry list of terms that you can apply to AI and kind of evaluate whether or not it hits a bar. I won't go into all of those here, but I thought it would be useful to give people that baseline.
Well, Heather, I have heard the term safe AI starting to be used more and more. That's somewhat new to me. Is that a term that's well defined? And is there a particular purpose for using that term?
I think that it helps us understand what the end state we're going for is. I don't think it's particularly well defined. And I say that also because there are a lot of different definitions of what safe AI is. But generally, it means AI that we think has an acceptable level of risk. And that risk actually hits a lot of those qualities. You're lowering risk by making your AI explainable and accurate and robust. Some of the other qualities that have been raised on that front, is your AI fair? Is it transparent, which is similar but not the same as explainable? Is it secure? Do you have accountability built in? There's a lot of different pieces of it, and I think different agencies and different companies and different people all focus on different elements of what makes AI safe. But that it is kind of a broad term that people are using in terms of that desired end goal.
Right.
So,
what about training data? Is this a good time to talk about that?
Why not?
What is training data? How is that used? What do we need to know about it?
So one of the things when we're going in and we're thinking about machine learning, we're not sitting down at a chalkboard and we're not saying, aha, here's how you're going to learn. And so when Manisha sits down in front of a classroom, she's training people very differently than we would train a model. The training data is this huge amount of data that you feed into the machine learning process to create that model. And a lot of these models use a huge amount of data. I think for situations like this, you will often say, here's my input data, and then you match it with output data, and you start training a model to say, if I see this input, I think the output should look like this. And I'm kind of tracing a wavy path there on purpose, because it can take some level of complexity into that model, like ends up in that model in no small part because of the amount of that training data. But you can train a simple model on a small amount of training data. You can create a highly capable model with a huge amount of data. But that training data will determine how your model acts.
So I don't want to jump the gun too much, but in terms of regulations, just broadly, then perhaps kind of a rule that touches on what data could be used or how it could be used could play a role in developing regulations for something that works with AI.
Absolutely. And I think that that's actually something a lot of people are thinking about right now. What kinds of data are fair game? And that's something, for example, the financial services industry has had to think about for a while. When they're making eligibility decisions, there's certain kinds of data that are fair game and are okay for them to use, and then certain kinds of data that they don't want to take into consideration. And that's a pretty simple version of this, but it's one example of how training data and input data can be controlled or restricted to change and kind of modify the behavior of a model.
And one more point, and then we can move on. But we also talked about generative AI and how that can be used to generate new code, as opposed to what's going on up until now, which is more boilerplate or more knowable code. And so the training data definitely falls into that, what the generative AI would or could do.
Absolutely. Generative AI is really amazing and in no small part responsible for everyone paying a lot of attention to AI right now. It is also the reason that I wanted to start with definitions, so thank you, because generative AI is not the whole of AI. I think you mentioned chatbots that people are using now, and that's a good example, because there are some very simple chatbots that aren't generative. I can go to a website, I can type in, I need help paying my phone bill. And that can be a very simple chatbot. It says, ooh, pay phone bill. You probably want to do this, and gives me a link. Alternately, a generative chatbot might say, oh, I see that you're doing this thing. And it has a much more narrative discussion because it's creating new text. But these tools, you can create images, you can create code, you can create text, like the sky's the limit in some ways, although we don't fully know what those capabilities will look like over time.
Right. Should we move to the next slide?
Excellent. I'm doing a lot of talking at the top. I promise I will. It's worth noting that there's a huge amount of attention being paid to AI on the policy front, which is, of course, why we're here today. The White House has had a number of announcements partnering with companies around responsibility, trustworthiness, ethics, security. They released a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. They have an upcoming executive order. Agencies are clarifying existing authorities, because all of the rules that these agencies have put out apply to AI, even if they don't name AI. AI is the tool that you're using to accomplish a goal. And so they still have authorities. And they are thinking about whether any of these new kinds of publicly available AI mean that they might need new authorities. CFPB, the FTC, EEOC, and then, of course, the FCC. Everyone is thinking about AI and how they can help protect people, how they can regulate, how they can understand the technology better. There's a ton of congressional AI proposals. I was actually counting up some of our tracking before this, and there's 35 or 40 active proposals right now. And then you mentioned tomorrow, Senator Schumer is kicking off his AI Insight Forums with leaders from across business and civil rights and arts and labor to talk about artificial intelligence and to talk about what it looks like and what Congress needs to learn. And then we have these 4 hearings. All of them are exploring different aspects of AI, and that's just this week. So I don't expect the pace to slow down. It's worth saying the courts are also grappling with AI cases as they think about what training data is reasonable and how some of these rules apply, even though they weren't written for AI. And I'd be a little bit remiss not to note that this is the dynamic that's happening all over the world too. It's not just the US.
Great, thanks. That was very helpful. Let's turn to, the heart of the matter, areas of use in the telecom industry. And before we do that, since we are doing this for CLE credit, let me give the code, which is Intelligence 2023. Intelligence 2023. I'll also give it at the end of the CLE for those of you who need credit. And we kind of brainstormed a little and pulled together a list of areas of use of AI in the telecom sector. This is kind of a very narrow list, and it can be expanded on greatly. Manisha, I'm going to turn to you now, and I think we talked a lot about different potential areas of use where the FCC might be thinking about regulating AI, if not immediately in the future. Network. Do you want to start with network management or spectrum sharing?
Yeah, so let's talk about network management. So network management, if you think about what a cellular network is doing, like literally at a millisecond level, it's managing a wide number of channels that, say, a base station has at its disposal. There are many base stations and they have to coordinate with each other so they don't transmit on the same frequencies and interfere with each other. There are various users who have different use cases. Somebody may be just making a phone call, somebody may be streaming video, somebody may be doing something else. And so putting all these knobs that, say, a cellular network has at its disposal, and by current count, I've heard numbers as large as 5,000 knobs that sometimes a network or a base station has, and matching those with the needs of not just one user, but all of the users that are using this network. So this is a huge network optimization problem that has been around forever. And in the past, these were very model driven. When I say model driven, it's simple things like, oh, this user has a really good signal strength and we can give them this data service they need. This user has weaker signal strength. Let's, pivot and give them a different frequency and slow down their data rate. And that's based on physical models. We know that if you've got signal strength, you're going to get a higher data rate. But now with all of the historical data that network providers have, they collect every piece of information, not exactly the bits going over the air, but the meta information, if you have 100 users in a certain area, what kind of coverage did they get? What kind of throughput? What kind of latency? Sometimes apps have satisfaction indicators built into them. And so they take all of that data and now they can do much more granular optimization. So that goes back to what Heather mentioned about, you're still adaptive. Networks were always adaptive. Now, because of the advent of computing, of the ability to gather all of this data at scale with much lower cost, they're bringing the data into that. So this is happening today. It's getting better and better. It allows you to do things like real-time threat detection. So if you have a pattern of what a normal network traffic behavior looks like, and if there's an anomaly, if there's somebody hogging the network in an area which sounds unusual, that pops up because your AI algorithms that are tracking the data usage can immediately flag those for you. So there are many, many uses of how you can do this network management. This kind of application of AI and data doesn't really fall under regulations, because this is really another tool that the network operators have at their disposal to offer better quality of service. I guess I mean, there may be cases where it needs to be regulated if it turns out that, for example, a network operator is consistently providing poor service to, say, a socioeconomically disadvantaged community. If that kind of behavior comes out during the data sets that you use. The piece on spectrum is, I think, much newer, and honestly, we are still not at the level of maturity in using AI tools for spectrum management that we could be. There have been very targeted research efforts. DARPA ran this Spectrum Collaboration Challenge a few years ago, where they basically provided a very complex problem where you had many kinds of military services, a very finite amount of spectrum, different kind of use cases. You had drones, you had vehicles on the ground, you had handheld phones, and they all needed to get data across at a certain throughput. And the goal was that could all these entities figure out the best way to use the spectrum among themselves without having the kind of very defined allocations that the FCC normally does. This was a toy problem. It was kind of a little bit similar to some of the environments that maybe the DoD faces when they deploy in the field. But it was a defined toy problem. And they did find that the more reactive you were to the data that you were gathering on the field, rather than making a priori static decisions about who would get what amount of spectrum, that kind of AI learning, very rapid learning based on the data that you're getting at a millisecond level, improved your performance dramatically. So the winner of it was set up as a competition, and the winner of the competition was the small company that came up with a very innovative way of evaluating all of the data, understanding how people were using the spectrum, and then making very fast decisions on the fly. So these are the kind of places where AI is already being used for spectrum and network management. The challenge again is data sets. So Heather mentioned, and I firmly feel that the bigger half, if you want to call it that way, of AI is really the data that's used. And we sometimes tend to forget about how important that is and it's not just the algorithms, it's also the data set you have. I mean, part of the reason that these language models, ChatGPT, have made such dramatic progress is because today you have the entire English language corpus at your disposal on the web. So the training set is massive. There is pretty much anything in terms of language. If you want to compose, the AI can go out there and look at the entire data set from Shakespeare to your modern authors and pull together something that really reads well. In networks and in wireless in general, we are not there yet. So each operator has data about their networks. They hold that very close to their heart. It's not something that's openly available. And speaking as an academic researcher, it makes my research a lot more difficult to do because I do not have access to the kind. So if I might have a really nice algorithm in mind, but in order to actually test it at scale, it becomes very difficult. The same is true for spectrum databases, and the NOI that you mentioned, Laura, I think is a first step to try and understand how one could even go about collecting the kind of data. I mean, what data do you need? So even when we talk about spectrum data, are we just saying that there is something out there, or do we want to know who is out there? It's a very different thing. We can take a spectrum analyzer and just measure energy levels, right? And that won't tell you much about who is using the spectrum. To go that one level down, you really need to be able to identify the actual signal being used. So that takes a little bit more effort to identify. And once you have this picture of, and the NOI was only on non-federal, which, you might wonder, why does the FCC need this information? Shouldn't they already have it? Because this is non-federal, it's all allocated by the FCC. The truth of the matter is, in anything related to spectrum, allocation and usage are two very different things. So there's a lot of spectrum bands that have been allocated for a certain use. They may not be used that often. And so the question is, if we learn how to identify this, if we can find where the gaps in the spectrum are, then we can do a better job of actually using AI and other tools to increase the efficiency of utilization in some of these bands.
Right. Let me interrupt it. I have several follow-up questions on some of that. One relates to the network management and whether we're at the level where you can actually change the network architecture autonomously, or whether you would want that. Because I would think that would start to touch on FCC's regulatory authority, obviously, if you were changing the network architecture in a way that would maybe create your interference potential or impede other users. So is that what we're talking about yet? Or
no, I don't think. I think we are talking about network management within the confines of the existing rules. So for example, a cellular provider has a number of channels that it is authorized to broadcast on, and the actual transmissions in terms of in-band energy, out-of-band energy, how much power you transmit, all of that will have to abide by FCC rules. Now, the choice of I am a user and I've just requested a download of a huge movie, what combination of channels should be used to serve me to the best performance that I want? That would be where the AI tools and the network management comes in. I think the part about changing, and you touched upon this already, is how do you regulate, say, a piece? The FCC knows very well how to regulate a piece of hardware. If it's a filter, you can measure what its out-of-band emissions are. If it's a radio or an antenna, you can measure the pattern. Now, if you say this is a device that, depending on the environment it is in, it's going to change its emission characteristics, then that becomes a very, very hard device to certify and, more importantly, to enforce, right? So, I mean, rules and enforcement goes hand in hand. If you are looking to certify something, you should also be able to know how do you enforce the rules if this doesn't behave the way it's supposed to. So I don't think we are there yet in terms of really understanding so when you certify an AI device, do you have to certify the data that was used to develop the model that this device is implementing as well? And then if you do that and you keep it static, then you've kind of reduced the effectiveness of the device because it's not being able to adapt as new data comes along. So there are a lot of issues about what do standards mean? And this is actually a discussion I'm having within the IEEE, which is an international electrical engineering organization, where we are beginning to ask that, are we ready to start thinking of standards for AI yet? Like we have standards for cellular systems, we have standards for Wi-Fi. And we know that once these standards are out there, every device will operate in a predictable way. They will interoperate with each other. And are we there yet to start thinking about what does it mean to have AI standards or devices? So it's really an emerging topic right now.
Interesting. Thanks. One thing, I mean, I keep going back to thinking about is some of the frequency bands that have been opened up and that are managed by database managers like white spaces, CBRS, now 6 gigahertz, and whether those bands at some point, given that there are database managers that have access to information, and perhaps they could be required to, keep the data and then use the data as training data and in some way get us to more of a spectrum management system that's more autonomous. Does that make any sense to you?
No, it absolutely makes a lot of sense. These databases that you mentioned today are quite static in the sense that you basically, if you're trying to protect an incumbent, you figure out, the data about, what this incumbent, where this incumbent is, what is its protection criteria, and then you apply propagation models to them and say, okay, if I am somebody this distance away from this incumbent, I will interfere, so I will not be able to use that channel. Now, we know that these propagation models are usually very, very overprotective. And they were designed at a time, I don't know, it's been decades old now. Yeah. Some of these models have been verified by actual measurements, but most haven't. And moreover, the wireless propagation environment is extremely hard to model with an equation because you have things like clutter. If your base station is on a lamppost versus if it's on the top of a building, the kind of clutter is where your signal is just being absorbed by stuff in your environment. Those are very difficult things to model, but those are really things that you can build up a data-based idea of what propagation looks like. Like over time, if you think about a base station and it's there, it's fixed, and it's been collecting this data from all of its users over, say, months and years, there is data in there where it can use a much better model for itself, which is very localized, very targeted towards that base station. However, the rules that we have now, in the way these databases are governed, don't allow you to adapt your protection contours based on what you're actually seeing on the ground.
Right.
Which is not, we are not being very efficient in spectrum usage when we do that. So a lot of the discussions in spectrum management, in the advanced spectrum sharing group that I was a co-chair of in the TAC, there were a lot of discussions about how do we move beyond this, fixed model-based propagation analysis.
Right, very, very static. So that'll be interesting to see, but I suspect it'll be some time off before we actually get there.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, how do you certify these? How do you enforce, if things go wrong and you end up creating interference based on an AI model of propagation. So there are a lot of these issues that need to be addressed before we can move there. And one of the recommendations, I think, that came out of the AI/ML group with the FCC TAC was to perhaps start some pilot projects where you test out some of these ideas in the real world and see how they work before you move to, rule making based on AI.
And are those areas that IEEE and other standard setting organizations are also talking about?
We will. Again, all of these discussions are just beginning to happen. There has been a lot of research in AI and wireless, and all of this activity now has to coalesce into this thinking about regulations and standards and enforcement and how you make it So, as Heather mentioned, part of the beauty of AI is it comes up with solutions that you may not have thought of, right? But on the other hand, it might come up with very harmful solutions too. And this is true for everything. It's true for what we're seeing, in images and videos and in networks as well. So we have to develop a much better understanding of how, do you need a human at the end to kind of differentiate between what these are? Which a lot of what that is kind of what a lot of is happening now. So, when you're writing an email and you have an auto compose and it's completing your sentences for you, it's using, language models to do that. But you at the end decide whether what it proposed was what you wanted it to say or not, right? So you are the human that's sort of making sure that the AI is not making you write something you didn't mean to. So how do you do that in, say, a network or spectrum management thing? So those are some of the longer issues, wider issues that have to be addressed.
Right. What about now? There's a NTIA is a big focus on ORAN, Open RAN technology, and there's a lot of funding going out to help support development of these devices and systems that are going to be more open. And how does AI play into all that? And is that a way for us to get useful data to help us get more autonomous over time?
Yeah, I think that is definitely one of the areas. So one of the problems that we face in the way our cellular networks are designed is that these are very, very complicated pieces of equipment. They're doing channel aggregation. They're doing all of these resource allocation, managing multiple users, but all of this is happening literally in a black box. So even from the network provider side, the data they have is kind of at the ends. What Open RAN does is sort of open up the stack and create interfaces and standardized interfaces so you can get many more of the internal data that is going through the RAN or the radio access network. So for example, if a user request comes in for a certain amount of throughput, and then the first layer is the radio intelligent controller, which decides how much bandwidth it needs, and then the next layer is which frequency it should use, and right now these intermediate points are not visible in terms of optimizing. So the idea is that if we had Open RAN and you had these different components, maybe coming from different vendors, and they all had these standard interfaces that they were connected to, you could optimize your network stack much better by having this intermediate data points that we don't have access to now. Even some of the network providers don't have access to now. That is the end goal. I think it's going to take a fair amount of time to get there, in the sense that, the whole idea is you're disaggregating the radio access network, but, it still has to be put back together for it to work. So, the question of who does that, how does this get built out, who's responsible for end-to-end performance, is this Open RAN architecture going to match the performance of a standard architecture, which has been around much longer? It has had a lot more time to optimize itself. But it's a great new way of looking at the way we do cellular networks, and it feeds into the notion of using AI to do better optimization.
Great, thanks. Any other areas you want to cover? Otherwise, we can talk about the TAC recommendations.
No, just, reemphasize, how important it is to be able to have representative data sets as we specifically look at wireless networks and optimization for that.
Which I think goes to NOI, which
Yeah.
we've already kind of been discussing. That's one possible outcome, obviously, it depends on what information gets in and what information the FCC is ultimately able to obtain. And
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps that's just one step that in their regulatory wheelhouse is maybe tweaking some rules at some point in time to require that the data be made available some way.
Yeah, I think within the academic community, we have talked about spectrum sensing, spectrum measurements for decades now, and there are one-off efforts to do this in a few universities. But spectrum cannot be just measured at one point. It needs to be pervasive. It has to be measured and understood across the entire area where it's being used.
And don't you also have to understand the effects on a particular device or type of device, right?
Yeah.
You spectrum sensing, you kind of understand what's happening operationally at a point in time, but then don't you also want to think about how each type of technology or device, is it
Absolutely
Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or whatever it is, and how
Yeah.
that's going to be impacted by what you're sensing and measuring.
Yeah, absolutely. I think understanding, and that goes a little bit into the other NOI that the FCC had some time back, which was the receiver characteristics, receiver standards. How devices react to spectrum, which is in their band and outside their band, is very much a function about how folks build their receivers.
Certainly. But let me move on to the TAC slide. And this is kind of a summary of what the TAC AI working group recommended. And you were there, Professor, so you can certainly fill us in. You were in a different working group, but I think you were kind of following along and listening in to what the AI working group was doing and looking at and recommending. I think that FCC code of conduct for AI that strikes me as more internal use. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that came out from the FCC liaisons who were also part of the TAC was, can they use AI tools to go through the comments and ex parte submissions that come in? So, should they be using these kind of tools to say summarize everything that comes in, come up with some kind. They don't do it now, and they do. I mean, it's really very, very competent engineers and lawyers in the FCC who read through all of the submissions and summarize them.
But sometimes there's huge numbers of
numbers, yes. And with every proceeding these days, they're really growing numbers. And so if you start using AI for that kind of activity, then yeah, I think you need some kind of code of conduct to make sure that your tool is not, throwing out all comments that are coming from one stakeholder and emphasizing comments coming from another stakeholder or some things like that.
Absolutely. And then I think the next point is also fairly generic in some ways, engaging with U.S. Did I just take us off of stop sharing?
Yeah.
Sorry.
While you get that up, I think it's a good one though, talking about how agencies in different parts of the government can information share.
Yes. And there were some conversations about this, I think, a couple of years ago. So, for example, one of the agencies that deals with it probably a lot is the FDA, because there are so many medical devices that are based on AI that come into the FDA for regulating. And they do, they have some kind of process for evaluating such devices and either certifying them or allowing them, because they're very hard. I mean, there are so many of these medical body worn devices that are being put out now that really depend on AI and data to give you advice, all this Fitbits and all of these things. So they do have, and they have best practices that could be useful for the agencies.
Right.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about is where different parts of the world can learn from each other in terms of those best practices. You're right. The FDA has a very important piece of this and expertise.
Imagine the Department of Justice might be dealing with some of these issues as well.
I'm not sure, like from my vantage point, I haven't seen many agencies who aren't thinking about this and realizing where they actually had developed that expertise and where they're thinking about this. And I really, because I don't think there's a sector that isn't using AI in interesting ways right now.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a huge amount of knowledge sharing within the government, outside of government, from companies to Congress. It's happening everywhere.
Right.
Now that I had the slide back up, monitoring and leveraging the EU's activities was on the tax list as well, in terms of best practices that maybe can be aligned, both sides of the ocean, which is always, I think, useful for industry. But the TAC did touch on existing regulations and implications for AI, and some of those were the current intercept and wiretap rules and the use of AI bots in robocalls. Did you have anything to add to that, Manisha, in terms of what the working group focused on?
No, I think so there was, I think safe uses of AI was something that we had a lot of speakers come in and talk about that. On the very, topic of networks using AI to, I already touched on that. Doing better propagation and optimization was something that we talked about quite a bit. Channel modeling. And 6G, 6G is still being defined, but there is a notion that 6G will be AI native. What that means is that, similar to what Open RAN is trying to do, is make interfaces that allow AI tools to work on data much more seamlessly than what 5G. 5G was never really designed with this in mind. So those are, some of the other topics. And by the way, the August presentation, the AI working group always has the most detailed slides in those presentations, and all the list of speakers who spoke there and a little synopsis of what they talked about is available on that slide set.
Okay, great. We have about 6 minutes left. We do have one question that came in. I don't know how well we can answer it. The question is, can you discuss from your perspective how Section 230 enforcement by the FCC might play into how the agency is thinking about regulating AI? And Section 230 is a piece of legislation that immunity to online platforms, from civil immunity, from civil liability in terms of what is available to the public on the platforms. And I'm not sure we know. I mean, I think it's kind of presumptive to assume that for one, that the agency is thinking of regulating AI. We think that something's going to happen at some point in time. I don't think we think anything's going to happen imminently. Or two, that the FCC is going to do anything to change its Section 230 enforcement. It's certainly a possibility now that we have a new commissioner on board, but I think it's way too early to speculate about what's going to happen. Does anyone else have anything else to add to that?
No, this is not a question that I'm equipped to actually answer, and I think you summarized it very well.
Right.
Sounds right. I do think that there's an intersection between AI and Section 230, but it's not like the Venn diagram, the overlap is small in terms of how they're going to intersect, likely. But that's me attempting to divine the future.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Exactly. Check back with us in a year, maybe, or two. In the few minutes we have left, do we want to talk a little bit about broader federal developments? Heather, I know that there's, the tech industry announced voluntary commitments in July that it made to the White House. Is there anything in those that may hit key FCC areas of regulation?
I think that there's going to be a lot of places that those commitments, and particularly what the companies and the White House are talking about, have the potential to overlap. Because a lot of what those commitments look like are kind of making sure you're doing the due diligence around artificial intelligence and your development of artificial intelligence, your use of artificial intelligence, to think through how you end up using it and how you should regulate it. I would be very surprised if the FCC didn't think about some of the security implications that the White House announcements also consider. And there's a fair bit of overlap. I think, Manisha, you mentioned some of the representative training data being important for ensuring that your models aren't discriminatory. And that was definitely considered by the White House as well. My suspicion is, and my hope is, that all of these different parts of government are going to do that information sharing and going to be thinking deep thoughts about where that expertise comes in, and we can bring it all together. My hope is also that we have a lot of discussion by folks in industry who are using these technologies and have the ability to really go in and think about what it looks like in practice, and really taking some of those ideas around best practices and codes of conduct to make them really implementable. There was a comment here around Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. And it's probably a good example, because we're taking a lot of these really high level descriptors of AI and the qualities of AI, trustworthiness, lack of bias, and asking all of these agencies and all of these companies to figure out how to take them and put them in practice in a really quick point of time. And agencies are struggling with that too, figuring out how we can make that a little bit easier. It is something I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, and I'm honestly glad to see such thoughtful FCC output on this. And Manisha, I'm giving you some credit for that in my own head. But thinking through how to make this all work well together instead of coming up with a bunch of fragmented national or global agreements.
I think the NIST has done a good job of pulling together their AI risk management framework. But I still view those as guidelines of how to use AI so it doesn't create situations that you'd rather not have. I still think there's a lot of work in doing deep dives into the technical aspects of AI too. There's lots of research money being spent on the explainability part, because that is really, if we can get a good handle on that, then we, I think, are in a better position than we are now as to why is it doing these things or making these suggestions.
Very good point. Well, thank you two for joining me today. I think it's been a great discussion. Before we conclude the webinar, for those of you who need the CLE code, again, it is Intelligence 2023. Thank you so much.
Thank you.